December 15, 1944, somewhere in the frozen forests along the Franco-German border, a light snow fell through the pine branches as temperatures dropped to -12 degrees Celsius. In the darkness, members of an elite German reconnaissance unit moved with confidence through terrain they had controlled for weeks, believing themselves masters of the winter landscape. They could not have imagined that somewhere in those same shadows, a single soldier with a rifle and unwavering determination would fundamentally alter their understanding of superiority, of fear, and of what one person could accomplish when everything was on the line. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What followed that night would become one of the most quietly extraordinary accounts of individual achievement in the entire European theatre. A story that military historians would later study, not for its scale, but for what it revealed about courage, skill, and the collision between prejudice and undeniable reality. This is the story of how Corporal James Augustus Williams proved that excellence recognizes no boundaries, and how an elite unit learned that lesson in the most profound way possible. The winter of 1944 had descended on northeastern France with particular brutality. For the American forces who had fought their way inland since the Normandy landing 6 months earlier, the advance had slowed to a grinding, exhausting crawl through mud, snow, and determined resistance. The 92nd Infantry Division, one of only 2 all-African-American divisions deployed to combat in the European theatre, found itself holding positions in the rugged, forested region near the German border, part of the Allied push that would eventually break through into Germany itself. Corporal James Augustus Williams had joined the 92nd Division after completing his training at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, in early 1944. A 24-year-old from rural Mississippi, Williams had grown up hunting deer and wild turkey in the dense forests near his family's small farm. His father, a sharecropper who had served in the First World War, had taught him to shoot when he was 8 years old, using an ancient bolt-action rifle that required perfect placement because they could rarely afford more than a handful of bullets at a time. Williams had developed a patience and precision that would later prove extraordinary, learning to wait for hours for a single perfect shot rather than waste ammunition on attempts that would merely wound and let an animal escape. The decision to allow African-American soldiers into combat roles had come grudgingly from a military establishment that had long maintained strict segregation. The 92nd Division and its sister unit, the 93rd, represented both an opportunity and a challenge. For the thousands of black soldiers who volunteered or were drafted, military service offered a chance to prove their worth, to fight for a country that had not always fought for them, and to perhaps return home with something that had been systematically denied, recognition as equals. Williams had arrived in Italy in June of 1944, and by autumn, his unit had been reassigned to southern France as part of the broader Allied operations following the successful landings in Normandy and on the Mediterranean coast. The 92nd Division took up positions in what would become known as the Maritime Alps sector, a mountainous, densely forested region where traditional warfare gave way to small unit actions, patrol encounters, and the constant, nerve-wracking pressure of operating in terrain that favored defenders. By December, Williams had participated in dozens of patrol actions and minor skirmishes. His skill with a rifle had not gone unnoticed. Sergeant Thomas Bradley, his platoon sergeant, had recognized early on that Williams possessed something beyond normal competence. In a report that would later be referenced in Williams's military file, Bradley wrote that the corporal demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to gauge distance, wind, and trajectory without instruments, that he could remain motionless for extended periods that would leave other soldiers cramping and restless, and that he possessed a calm under pressure that seemed to intensify rather than deteriorate when circumstances became most dangerous. The rifle Williams carried was a standard-issue M1903 Springfield, a bolt-action weapon that had been the primary American infantry rifle during the First World War and remained in service for specialized roles. The Springfield was renowned for its accuracy, capable of precise shots at distances exceeding 800 meters in the hands of a skilled marksman. Williams had been issued an M1903A4 variant, which included a Weaver 333 telescopic sight, a modification that transformed the already accurate rifle into a genuine precision instrument. The weapon itself weighed approximately 8.7 kilograms when fully loaded, with a 5-round internal magazine that required manual loading after each shot was fired. The German forces opposing the 92nd Division in that sector included regular infantry units supplemented by specialized reconnaissance teams tasked with gathering intelligence on American positions, identifying weak points in the Allied lines, and conducting harassment operations designed to keep enemy forces off balance. One such unit was the 14th Reconnaissance Company, a formation that had earned a reputation for effectiveness in mountain and forest operations. The company consisted of approximately 120 soldiers, organized into smaller teams of 8 to 12 men who could operate independently for extended periods behind enemy lines. Captain Friedrich Holzer commanded the 14th Reconnaissance Company with the confidence of a professional soldier who had survived 3 years of combat across multiple fronts. A 32-year-old from Bavaria, Holzer had joined the military in 1935 and had seen action in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front before being transferred west in late 1944. His record indicated a capable officer who emphasized thorough preparation and maintained strict discipline among his soldiers. The men under his command were veterans selected for their skills in navigation, survival, and small unit tactics. On the evening of December 14th, Holzer received orders to conduct a reconnaissance operation into the sector held by elements of the 92nd Division. Intelligence reports suggested that the American forces in that area were thinly spread, possibly vulnerable to a larger operation if weaknesses could be identified and exploited. Holzer selected 24 men from his company, dividing them into 3 teams of 8 soldiers each. The plan called for the teams to infiltrate American positions under cover of darkness, observe defensive arrangements, identify supply routes and command posts, and withdraw before dawn. It was a mission the unit had executed successfully numerous times before. Holzer's confidence stemmed not just from his unit's experience, but from assumptions that, while never stated officially, pervaded the thinking of many in the German military leadership. The 92nd Division's composition was well known through intelligence reports and propaganda. African-American soldiers, according to the prejudices that shaped both German and, ironically, American military thinking at the time, were considered less capable, less motivated, and less dangerous than their white counterparts. This was not mere propaganda, but a deeply held belief that influenced tactical decisions and risk assessments. Holzer expected his teams to encounter opposition, certainly, but not opposition that would require extraordinary caution or creativity to overcome. The German reconnaissance teams crossed into American-held territory shortly after 2200 hours on December 14th. The night was cold and clear, with a quarter moon providing just enough light to navigate by, without requiring artificial illumination that might give away their positions. The teams moved in a staggered formation, maintaining communication through prearranged hand signals and brief whispered exchanges. Each soldier carried minimal equipment, lightweight weapons, and rations sufficient for 36 hours. Their primary weapons were MP-40 submachine guns and Kar 98K carbines, compact and reliable firearms suited for the close-range encounters typical of forest combat. Team 2, led by Sergeant Klaus Zimmermann, consisted of 8 experienced soldiers whose average age was 26 years. Zimmermann himself was a veteran of the Eastern Front who had earned the Iron Cross Second Class for actions during the retreat from Soviet territory earlier in the year. Among his team was Corporal Hans Richter, a former hunting guide from Austria, who served as the team's primary scout, and Private Ernst Vogel, a 20-year-old from Cologne who kept a detailed journal, portions of which would later provide historical documentation of the events that followed. Team 2's assigned route took them through a heavily forested valley approximately 3 kilometers behind the main American defensive positions. Their objective was to locate and observe a supply depot that intelligence suggested existed somewhere in that sector. If they could identify the depot's exact location, its size, and the routes used to transport materials to the front lines, that information could prove valuable for planning future operations. The American defensive positions in that sector were manned by elements of 2nd Battalion, 371st Infantry Regiment, 92nd Division. The battalion had been in position for 11 days, rotating soldiers between frontline posts, reserve positions, and rest areas in a pattern designed to maintain alertness while preventing the exhaustion that came from continuous exposure to the stress of potential contact. The supply depot the German team sought was indeed located approximately 3 kilometers behind the main line, a collection of camouflaged tents and temporary structures where ammunition, food, medical supplies, and other essential materials were staged before being moved forward to the soldiers who needed them. Corporal Williams had been assigned to a 2-man observation post approximately 800 meters from the supply depot, positioned on high ground that offered clear sight lines across several natural approaches through the forest. His partner was Private First Class Robert Davis, a 19-year-old from Chicago who had been with the division for 4 months. The observation post consisted of a shallow foxhole improved with logs and branches to provide overhead cover against shell fragments, with firing positions cut through the camouflage that allowed the occupants to observe their sector without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Williams and Davis had occupied the position since dusk, part of the battalion's defensive network designed to provide early warning if enemy forces attempted to approach American positions under cover of darkness. They maintained strict noise discipline, communicating in whispers and remaining motionless, except when necessary to maintain circulation in the bitter cold. Both men wore multiple layers of clothing beneath their field jackets, wool gloves with trigger fingers cut away, and wool caps pulled low over their ears. Despite these precautions, the cold was a constant, draining presence that sapped energy and made every hour feel like 3. At approximately 2300 hours, Williams detected movement in the forest approximately 500 meters from their position. He had been scanning his sector through the telescopic sight on his Springfield, a practice that he maintained constantly, despite the fatigue that made most soldiers less vigilant as nights wore on. The movement was subtle, a displacement of shadows that did not match the normal patterns of wind-moved branches or the occasional deer or wild boar that inhabited the forest. Williams watched without moving, his breathing slow and controlled as the shadow resolved itself into a human figure moving carefully through the trees. Williams touched Davis's arm, 2 gentle taps that was their prearranged signal for contact. Davis shifted position slowly, bringing his own rifle to bear on the area Williams indicated with the slightest movement of his head. Through his scope, Williams could now identify not one but several figures moving in a loose formation, maintaining intervals that suggested military training and tactical awareness. The figures moved toward the American positions, not directly toward Williams and Davis, but on a trajectory that would bring them within 400 meters if they continued on their current path. The correct procedure, as outlined in the standing orders every soldier in the battalion had been briefed on, was to observe and report. Observation posts were not expected to engage unless directly threatened. Their primary function was to serve as an early warning system, alerting headquarters to enemy movement so that appropriate responses could be organized. Williams understood this procedure perfectly. He also understood something else, something he had learned not from military manuals but from his father during those long hours hunting in Mississippi forests. Sometimes the opportunity for a perfect shot comes only once, and the cost of not taking it can be far higher than the risk of taking it. The German team continued forward, their formation indicative of confidence rather than excessive caution. They moved at a steady pace that would have been admirable under different circumstances, each soldier alert, but apparently unworried about immediate threats. Williams counted 8 distinct figures, their equipment and weapons visible in brief moments when moonlight penetrated the forest canopy. They were heading directly toward an area where the forest thinned slightly, a natural clearing approximately 300 meters from Williams's position where several trails converged. If they reached that point, they would be in an ideal location to observe the supply depot and the routes that connected it to forward positions. Williams made a decision that would later be examined, questioned, and ultimately vindicated. Rather than immediately report the contact and risk alerting the German team through radio transmission noise, he chose to eliminate the threat himself. The decision was based on several calculations that passed through his mind in seconds. The German team was moving toward positions that would compromise the entire sector's security. Any delay in responding would allow them to acquire intelligence that could endanger the entire battalion, and his position offered clear sightlines that might not be available to any response force that could be organized in time. He whispered to Davis, telling him to remain still and ready to provide covering fire if needed, but not to shoot unless Williams fired first or the Germans discovered their position. Davis nodded, his young face tight with tension, but trusting in Williams' judgment. Williams returned his attention to the scope, tracking the lead German soldier as the team entered the clearing. The distance was approximately 320 meters, a challenging shot under ideal conditions, considerably more difficult at night with a target that was moving, however slowly. Williams had to account for the bullet's trajectory, which would drop approximately 30 centimeters over that distance, and for the slight wind that he could feel against his face, perhaps 3 kilometers per hour from the left, enough to push a bullet perhaps 5 centimeters off target. He also had to account for the cold, which affected both the powder charge in the cartridge and the metal components of the rifle itself, potentially changing the point of impact by small but significant margins. Williams controlled his breathing, a technique his father had taught him decades earlier. He inhaled slowly, exhaled partially, and held his breath at the natural pause between breaths when his body was most still. The crosshairs of his scope centered on the lead German soldier's upper torso, adjusted slightly left to account for wind, slightly high to account for bullet drop. The German paused, turning to signal something to the soldiers behind him, and in that moment of stillness, Williams squeezed the trigger. The Springfield's report shattered the night's silence, a sharp crack that echoed through the forest and sent birds exploding from nearby trees in panic. Through the scope, Williams saw the German soldier collapse, his body going instantly limp in a way that left no doubt about the shot's effectiveness. The other German soldiers reacted with the trained speed of veterans, dropping into prone positions and seeking cover behind trees and fallen logs. Williams was already working the bolt action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round, his movements so practiced that they required no conscious thought. The German team was now alert and taking cover, but they faced a fundamental problem. They did not know where the shot had come from. The sound of the rifle's report echoed through the forest, making precise location impossible from sound alone. And Williams's position on higher ground with excellent camouflage meant there was no muzzle flash to betray him. The Germans knew they were under fire, but from which direction and from how many weapons they could not immediately determine. Williams tracked another soldier who was moving from one tree to another, attempting to reach a position with better cover. The movement required the soldier to cross a gap perhaps 3 meters wide, which at a combat stride would take approximately 2 seconds. Williams led the target slightly, anticipating where the soldier would be when the bullet arrived, and fired his second shot. This one struck the soldier mid-stride, and he went down without the controlled fall of someone taking cover, but rather the uncontrolled collapse of someone who could no longer control their movements. The remaining 6 German soldiers now understood they were facing accurate, disciplined fire from an unknown number of opponents in an unknown location. Sergeant Zimmerman, commanding the team from a position behind a large oak tree, made the tactically sound decision to withdraw. He signaled his remaining soldiers to fall back, using the covered routes they had approached by, a standard response to an ambush situation. The team began to execute the withdrawal in pairs, with 2 soldiers providing covering positions while 2 others moved, then reversing roles in a leapfrog pattern that minimized exposure. Williams did not allow them to withdraw cleanly. As one soldier rose to move, Williams fired his 3rd shot, and the soldier went down clutching his leg. The wound was not immediately life-threatening, but it eliminated the soldier's ability to move quickly and created a tactical dilemma for Zimmerman. Leave the wounded man behind or slow the entire team's withdrawal by helping him. Military doctrine said, leave him. Human instinct said, help him. And in that moment of hesitation, Williams fired again. The 4th shot struck a soldier who had paused to help his wounded comrade. Now there were 2 soldiers down and 4 still mobile, but the psychological impact was devastating. They were being systematically targeted by someone they could not see, could not locate, and apparently could not escape from. Zimmermann made the agonizing decision to leave the wounded and continue the withdrawal, ordering his remaining mobile soldiers to fall back with maximum speed. The 3 soldiers, still able to move quickly, began a fighting retreat, moving from cover to cover in unpredictable patterns that made tracking them difficult. Williams fired his 5th shot at a German soldier who momentarily exposed himself while moving between trees. The shot missed, the bullet striking the tree trunk and sending bark fragments flying. Williams worked the bolt action and fired again, and this shot found its mark, striking the soldier in the shoulder and spinning him around before he collapsed behind a fallen log. Zimmermann and the 2 remaining mobile soldiers accelerated their withdrawal, abandoning any attempt at tactical discipline in favor of speed, crashing through underbrush and moving with the desperate energy of men who understood they were facing something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Williams tracked them through his scope, but held his fire. The range was increasing rapidly as they fled, and the targets were moving erratically through dense forest. More importantly, Williams had achieved his primary objective. The German team had been stopped, prevented from reaching positions where they could observe American installations, and forced to retreat, having accomplished nothing except losing men and equipment. He lowered his rifle and finally allowed himself to take a full breath, his heart pounding from the adrenaline that had sustained him through the engagement. Davis was staring at him with an expression that mixed awe, disbelief, and something approaching fear. In the space of perhaps 4 minutes, he had watched Williams engage and effectively destroy an entire German reconnaissance team, firing with a precision and calm that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Davis started to speak, but Williams held up a hand for silence, then reached for the field radio to report the contact to battalion headquarters. The radio call reached the battalion command post at 23:13 hours. Major David Henderson, commanding 2nd Battalion, initially responded to the report with skepticism. An observation post claiming to have stopped an entire German patrol with rifle fire sounded like either exaggeration or confusion. Henderson ordered Williams and Davis to remain in position and maintain observation while he organized a response force to investigate the contact area. At first light on December 15th, a patrol from Baker Company's 2nd Battalion moved forward to the clearing where Williams had reported engaging the German team. What they found confirmed every detail of Williams' account. 2 German soldiers lay where they had fallen, their equipment intact and documents in their pockets, identifying them as members of the 14th Reconnaissance Company. Blood trails indicated that at least 2 other soldiers had been wounded and evacuated by their comrades. Shell casings from Williams's Springfield lay scattered around his position, and the patrol was able to reconstruct the engagement from the physical evidence with remarkable precision. The documents recovered from the fallen German soldiers provided intelligence of significant value. Maps marked with planned reconnaissance routes, written orders detailing the mission objectives, and personal items that helped intelligence officers build a more complete picture of the unit they were facing. More importantly, the engagement had clearly disrupted whatever larger plan the German forces had been executing, forcing them to abort or delay operations that depended on the intelligence the reconnaissance mission was meant to gather. Major Henderson visited Williams' observation post personally later that morning. He was a West Point graduate from Virginia, 31 years old, who had commanded the battalion since September. Henderson represented the complex contradictions of the American military at that time, a professional officer who believed in merit and competence but had been raised in a segregated society that taught him to view African-American soldiers as inferior. What he found at the observation post challenged those assumptions in ways that left him visibly uncomfortable. Williams showed Henderson the positions from which he had fired, explained his tactical reasoning for engaging, rather than merely reporting, and walked the major through his calculations for each shot. Henderson examined the sight lines, measured the distances, and reviewed the physical evidence. The engagement had occurred at ranges and under conditions that would have challenged even dedicated marksmen with specialized training. Williams had accomplished it with standard-issue equipment, minimal support, and apparently complete confidence in his abilities. Henderson's report to regimental headquarters included a recommendation that Williams be recognized for his actions. Though the language of the recommendation reflected Henderson's internal struggle, He acknowledged Williams's skill and effectiveness, while also noting his departure from standard procedure in engaging without orders. The report was factual and fair, but it lacked the enthusiastic praise that might have accompanied a similar achievement by a white soldier. Nevertheless, it was a recommendation, and in the context of 1944, even that represented a form of progress. The German 14th Reconnaissance Company, meanwhile, was attempting to understand what had happened to Team 2. Sergeant Zimmermann and his 2 surviving unwounded soldiers had returned to German positions shortly before dawn on December 15th, exhausted, traumatized, and with a story that seemed almost incredible. They reported encountering what appeared to be a single sniper who had systematically destroyed their team with precision fire from an unknown location under conditions that should have made such accuracy impossible. Captain Holzer listened to the report with growing concern, not just for the loss of men and the failed mission, but for what the engagement suggested about American capabilities in that sector. Holzer's understanding of the American forces, shaped by briefings and prevailing assumptions, had not prepared him for the possibility that individual American soldiers, particularly those in the segregated units, might possess world-class skills. The encounter forced a reassessment that was both tactical and psychological. If one American soldier could inflict such damage on an experienced reconnaissance team, what might a coordinated defense be capable of? Were there other soldiers with similar capabilities, or had Team 2 simply encountered an exceptional individual? The uncertainty was, in some ways, more troubling than confirmation would have been. The story of Williams's engagement spread through the 92nd Division with remarkable speed. Soldiers who had endured both the dangers of combat and the indignity of fighting for a nation that treated them as second-class citizens found in Williams' achievement something that went beyond a tactical success. It was proof, tangible and undeniable, that excellence resided in individuals regardless of the artificial categories societies constructed. For young black soldiers who had grown up under Jim Crow laws, who had been told both explicitly and implicitly that they were inferior, Williams's night of precision shooting represented a powerful counter-narrative. Private First Class Davis, Williams's partner in the observation post, became an inadvertent evangelist for the story. Wherever he went in the days following the engagement, soldiers asked him for details, and Davis obliged with accounts that, while dramatic, were fundamentally accurate. He described Williams's calm, his careful calculations, his steady hands in freezing temperatures, and his refusal to waste shots or fire without clear targets. Davis admitted freely that he had done nothing except watch, that the engagement had been Williams's show from start to finish, and that he had never seen anything like it before and expected never to see anything like it again. The following night saw an interesting shift in German reconnaissance activity in that sector. The aggressive probes that had characterized German operations in the area for weeks became notably more cautious. Patrols moved more slowly, used more circuitous routes, and generally behaved as though they expected to encounter skilled opposition at any moment. Whether this was directly due to Team 2's experience or part of a broader German pullback was difficult to determine. But soldiers in the 92nd Division credited Williams' shooting with making the Germans more respectful of American positions. On December 20th, 5 days after the engagement, Williams received orders to report to regimental headquarters. He made the journey to the rear area with some trepidation, uncertain whether he was to be commended for his effectiveness or disciplined for engaging without explicit orders. What he found was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Graham, commanding officer of the 371st Infantry Regiment, who wanted to hear Williams's account directly and understand exactly how one soldier with one rifle had accomplished what small units usually required coordinated fire to achieve. Graham was a career officer from Philadelphia, 42 years old, who had commanded the regiment since its activation. Unlike some officers who viewed their assignment to command black troops as a punishment or career limitation, Graham had approached the role as both a responsibility and an opportunity. He believed that the 92nd Division's performance in combat would have implications far beyond the immediate military situation. That success would provide arguments for integration and equality, while failure would be used to justify continued segregation. He saw in Williams not just a skilled soldier, but a representative of possibilities that the military establishment had systematically denied. Their conversation lasted more than an hour. Graham asked detailed questions about Williams's background, his hunting experience, his training, and his thought process during the engagement. Williams answered honestly and without false modesty, explaining that he had grown up shooting because his family needed the meat he could provide, that accuracy mattered because bullets were expensive, and that patience was essential because a wounded deer could run for kilometers and be lost entirely. He described the engagement in practical terms, noting distances, wind conditions, and sight pictures, treating the elimination of German soldiers with the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used describing deer hunting. Graham recognized something in Williams that went beyond shooting skills. Here was a soldier who understood his capabilities, trusted his training and experience, and could make split-second decisions under pressure that most people would agonize over for hours. The fact that Williams was black should have been irrelevant to any objective assessment of his value as a soldier. But in 1944, it was anything but irrelevant. Graham understood that Williams's achievement could be either highlighted or buried depending on decisions made by officers far above his rank, and he resolved to do everything in his power to ensure the former rather than the latter. On December 28th, Williams received official notice that he had been awarded the Bronze Star Medal for Valor. The citation accompanying the award recognized his actions on the night of December 14th through 15th, noting his initiative, skill, and effectiveness in stopping an enemy reconnaissance operation and inflicting significant losses on German forces. The language was formal and somewhat restrained, but the award itself was significant. The Bronze Star had been established only a year earlier, in February 1944, to recognize meritorious achievement in ground combat. For a soldier in the segregated 92nd Division to receive the award was noteworthy, a recognition that crossed the boundaries that usually limited how African-American soldiers were acknowledged. The award ceremony took place at regimental headquarters on January 3, 1945. Williams stood at attention while Colonel Graham pinned the medal to his uniform, offered congratulations, and shook his hand. The ceremony was brief and relatively informal, attended by perhaps 30 soldiers and officers, but for those present, it represented something larger than one soldier receiving one medal. It was an acknowledgement that skill, courage, and effectiveness could not be denied or dismissed based on race, that excellence demanded recognition regardless of the prejudices that shaped military policy and social structure. Williams wore the Bronze Star on his uniform for the remainder of his service, but he rarely discussed the engagement that earned it. When asked, he would offer brief factual responses that minimized his role and avoided anything that might sound like boasting. His modesty was both personal and tactical. He understood that too much pride or too much visibility could make him a target, not just for enemy soldiers, but for those within the American military who resented any suggestion that black soldiers could excel in combat. The war in Europe continued for another 4 months after Williams's December engagement. The 92nd Division participated in the spring offensive in northern Italy, breaching German defensive positions and advancing into the Po River Valley as Axis forces in Italy collapsed. Williams continued to serve as a rifleman and occasional designated marksman, participating in patrol actions and small unit engagements. He never again had an opportunity quite like that December night, but his reputation ensured that he was often given assignments that required precision shooting, and he consistently performed with the same calm effectiveness that had characterized his original engagement. The broader story of African American soldiers in World War II is one of contradiction and complexity. Approximately 1.2 million black soldiers served in the American military during the conflict, representing roughly 10% of total military personnel. The vast majority served in segregated units, often assigned to support roles rather than combat positions, reflecting the military establishment's belief that black soldiers were unsuitable for frontline duty. The 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions, along with several tank and artillery battalions, represented exceptions to this pattern, units where black soldiers served in direct combat roles under circumstances that would provide evidence either for or against the prevailing racial assumptions. The performance of these units was evaluated with an intensity that white units never faced. Every success was scrutinized for evidence it might have been exaggerated, every failure analyzed for confirmation of pre-existing prejudices. The 92nd Division's record was mixed, which was typical of infantry divisions operating under difficult conditions with variable leadership and support. Some operations succeeded brilliantly, others failed or achieved only partial success. But where a white division might be evaluated based on its overall performance and adjusted leadership or training as needed, the 92nd Division's performance was often treated as evidence about the capabilities of all black soldiers, a burden that was both unfair and revealing of the assumptions that shaped military policy. Williams returned to the United States in July 1945, 2 months after Germany surrendered, and the European War ended. He was discharged from military service in September 1945 with an honorable discharge, his Bronze Star Medal, several campaign ribbons, and the official thanks of a grateful nation. What he did not receive was the recognition that his achievement deserved, the acknowledgement that on one cold December night he had demonstrated skills that would have made him legendary if he had been white. The detailed accounts of his engagement remained buried in after-action reports and personnel files, known to those who had witnessed it, but not publicized or celebrated beyond the immediate circle of the 92nd Division. Williams returned to Mississippi and to farming, using his veteran benefits to purchase a small piece of land that he worked for the next 4 decades. He married in 1947, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet life that gave little indication of what he had accomplished during the war. Occasionally, veterans from the 92nd Division would visit, and they would talk about old times, about Italy and France and the men they had known. Williams never initiated these conversations about the war, but he listened politely when others did, and sometimes, very rarely, he would share a detail or two about that December night. The German soldier who survived Team 2's encounter with Williams, Ernst Vogel, returned to Germany after the conflict ended and eventually became a teacher in Cologne. His journal, which he had kept throughout the war, provided one of the few German perspectives on what happened that night. Vogel wrote with remarkable honesty about the encounter, describing his terror when his comrades began falling to invisible fire, his shame at fleeing, and his gradual understanding that they had faced someone whose skill far exceeded what they had been led to expect from American soldiers, particularly those in segregated units. In an entry dated January 1945, written while recovering from wounds received in a subsequent engagement, Vogel wrote that the encounter in France had fundamentally changed his understanding of human capability, that whoever had been shooting that night had possessed a gift that transcended nationality or race, and that he hoped never to face such a person again. The question of what might have happened if Williams had been recognized during the war for what he truly was, one of the finest marksmen in the American military, remains a matter of speculation. Would he have been assigned to specialized sniper training? Would his skills have been utilized more systematically? Would his success have challenged the assumptions that kept black soldiers in segregated units with limited opportunities? The historical record cannot answer these questions definitively, but the very fact they can be asked reveals the waste inherent in a system that judged soldiers by race rather than capability. In 1996, a historian researching the 92nd Infantry Division's service records came across Williams's after-action reports and the supporting documentation from the December 1944 engagement. Intrigued by what appeared to be an extraordinary but under-recognized achievement, the historian Dr. Patricia Morrison began a more detailed investigation. She located surviving members of Williams's unit, interviewed them, tracked down German records related to the 14th Reconnaissance Company, and gradually assembled a comprehensive picture of what had occurred that night. Morrison's research revealed several additional details that heightened the significance of Williams's achievement. The distance calculations in the original reports, based on estimates, were actually conservative. When Morrison visited the site in France and used modern surveying equipment, she determined that Williams's shots had been made at ranges between 310 and 420 meters, somewhat longer than initially reported. The weather conditions were also worse than remembered, with temperatures closer to -15 degrees Celsius and wind gusts periodically exceeding 8 kilometers per hour. Under these conditions, the precision Williams demonstrated bordered on the extraordinary. Morrison also discovered that the German 14th Reconnaissance Company had been considered one of the most effective units of its type in that sector, with a record of successful operations that dated back to early 1944. The company's loss of an entire team to a single enemy soldier was sufficiently unusual that it had generated reports up the German chain of command, with senior officers demanding explanations for how such a thing could have occurred. The responses to those inquiries, preserved in German military archives, revealed the same reluctance to accept that one American soldier, particularly from a segregated unit, could have been solely responsible for the outcome. Williams was still alive when Morrison completed her research in 1998. She traveled to Mississippi to interview him, finding a 78-year-old man living in a modest house on land he had farmed for 5 decades. Williams was initially reluctant to discuss the war, but Morrison's thorough knowledge of the details and her genuine interest in understanding rather than sensationalizing eventually convinced him to share his perspective more fully than he had in previous decades. Williams told Morrison that the night of December 14th-15th had not felt particularly extraordinary to him at the time. He had seen a threat to his unit and his fellow soldiers, had an opportunity to address that threat with the skills he possessed, and had done so to the best of his ability. The fact that he was black and the German soldiers were members of an elite unit had not been relevant to his thinking in the moment. He had been a soldier doing his job, and he had succeeded because his training, experience, and natural aptitude had prepared him for exactly that situation. The broader implications about race and capability were things other people worried about. Williams had been focused on sight pictures, wind drift, and trigger control. Morrison asked Williams if he felt bitter about the lack of recognition he had received, about the fact that his achievement had been largely forgotten, while lesser accomplishments by white soldiers had been celebrated and publicized. Williams thought about the question for a long time before answering. He told Morrison that bitterness would require him to have expected something different, to have believed that the military or the country would treat him fairly based solely on his performance. He had never held those beliefs. He had known from childhood that the world he lived in would not give him credit for his achievements, would not acknowledge his abilities, would systematically minimize anything he accomplished. Given those expectations, he could not feel bitter about their fulfillment. What he felt instead was pride in having done his job well, in having protected his fellow soldiers, and in having come home alive to build a life that, while modest, was his own. Morrison's research resulted in a journal article published in a military history journal in 1999, detailing Williams's achievement and placing it in the broader context of African-American military service during World War II. The article received modest attention in academic circles, but did not break through to wider public awareness. Williams himself passed away in 2003 at the age of 83. His obituary in the local newspaper, mentioning his military service in a single sentence that included no details about his Bronze Star or the engagement that earned it. The story of that December night continues to resonate for what it reveals about individual excellence and systemic prejudice. Williams possessed demonstrable world-class skills in marksmanship, skills that would have made him valuable in any context. But those skills were underutilized and under-recognized because of the color of his skin. He performed an extraordinary feat under circumstances that would challenge even the most highly trained specialists, yet his achievement was documented, filed, and largely forgotten. The German soldiers who survived the encounter knew they had faced something exceptional, but their testimony was filtered through assumptions about race that made accepting the truth difficult. Modern military snipers who learn about Williams's engagement recognize immediately the magnitude of what he accomplished. Making multiple precision shots at ranges exceeding 300 meters, at night, in freezing conditions, with a bolt-action rifle and fixed power optic, against trained soldiers who were taking appropriate cover and attempting tactical responses, represents a combination of skill, nerve, and judgment that places Williams among the finest marksmen of his era. The fact that he accomplished this without specialized sniper training, without the extensive support systems modern snipers rely on, and without the recognition that would have both honored his achievement and potentially saved additional lives by better utilizing his skills, makes the story both inspiring and tragic. The 92nd Infantry Division was deactivated after World War II, though it was later reactivated and served in subsequent conflicts. The division's combat record during the war remained controversial for decades, with some historians emphasizing its difficulties and failures, while others highlighted its successes and the unfair burdens placed on segregated units. The truth, as is often the case, lay in the complexity. The 92nd Division performed like most infantry divisions, with some excellent soldiers and some poor ones, some good decisions and some bad ones, some successes and some failures. The difference was that its performance was evaluated not on its own merits, but as evidence in an ideological debate about race and capability. Individual soldiers like Williams demonstrated conclusively that race had nothing to do with military capability. That excellence existed wherever talent and opportunity combined, regardless of skin color. But individual demonstrations, no matter how dramatic, could not immediately overcome institutional prejudices reinforced by centuries of ideology. It would take decades, additional conflicts, the civil rights movement, and persistent pressure from both within and outside the military before the American armed forces fully integrated and began evaluating soldiers solely on their abilities rather than their race. The site where Williams made his stand on that December night is now part of a regional forest preserve in northeastern France. There is no marker commemorating what happened there, no indication that the clearing where German soldiers fell to precision rifle fire witnessed something that should be remembered. The forest has reclaimed the old foxholes and observation posts. The supply depot is long gone, and few people walking those trails today would have any idea that they are passing through a place where history unfolded in ways both large and small. The larger historical significance of Williams's achievement lies not in the tactical impact, which while real was limited to one sector on one night, but in what it demonstrated about human potential and the costs of prejudice. How many other soldiers in segregated units possessed exceptional skills that were never recognized, never utilized, never celebrated? How many opportunities were missed because talent was evaluated through the lens of race rather than ability? The waste inherent in discrimination extends beyond the individuals affected to encompass the organizations and societies that deprive themselves of excellence because they cannot see past artificial categories. Modern armies understand that snipers are force multipliers, that one skilled marksman properly positioned can accomplish objectives that might otherwise require dozens of soldiers and significant firepower. They invest substantial resources in identifying soldiers with natural aptitude for precision shooting, training them extensively, equipping them with specialized weapons and optics, and deploying them in ways that maximize their effectiveness. Williams possessed the natural aptitude and taught himself the skills, but he never received the specialized training, equipment, or deployment that would have made him truly devastating. His achievement was not what he accomplished with the resources available to him, impressive as that was, but what he might have accomplished if given the same support and recognition that white soldiers with similar abilities received. The psychological impact on the German reconnaissance company following the loss of Team 2 extended well beyond the immediate tactical situation. Soldiers who had been confident in their superiority, who had approached operations in American-held sectors with perhaps insufficient caution, found themselves facing an uncertainty that was deeply unsettling. If a single American soldier could inflict such damage, what did that say about their assumptions regarding American capabilities? The dissonance between what they had been told to expect and what they had actually encountered created a kind of cognitive crisis that affected not just their tactical decisions, but their broader understanding of the conflict. For the African-American soldiers of the 92nd Division, Williams' achievement provided something equally powerful but opposite in nature: confirmation that their abilities were equal to anyone's, that the limitations placed on them were social constructs rather than natural facts. Young soldiers who had grown up being told they were inferior, who had been systematically denied opportunities and recognition, could look at Williams's Bronze Star and know that at least one of their own had done something undeniable, something that forced even reluctant recognition from a military establishment that preferred to maintain its prejudices. The historical record of World War II is filled with stories of individual courage and exceptional achievement. Some of these stories have been told and retold until they became part of national mythology, celebrated in books, films, and commemorations. Others, like Williams's, remained obscure not because they lacked merit, but because they did not fit convenient narratives or serve institutional interests. The selective memory of history, the choices about which stories to preserve and promote, and which to allow to fade, reveals as much about the values and prejudices of those doing the remembering as it does about the events themselves. In the years following Morrison's research, a small group of military historians and veterans advocates attempted to have Williams's award upgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross or Silver Star, recognizing that what he accomplished on December 14th exceeded the typical standards for a Bronze Star. The effort faced bureaucratic obstacles related to the passage of time, the difficulty of locating additional documentation, and institutional reluctance to revisit decisions made decades earlier. While the upgrade attempt ultimately proved unsuccessful, the effort itself brought Williams's story to wider attention within military communities, where it has become something of a case study in both exceptional marksmanship and the historical impact of racial prejudice on military recognition. The technical aspects of what Williams accomplished deserve particular attention because they highlight just how difficult his shots were. Modern ballistic analysis, using the specifications of the M1903 Springfield rifle, the 30-06 ammunition standard at the time, and environmental conditions documented from weather records, indicates that Williams's shots required compensation for approximately 35 to 40 centimeters of bullet drop and 5 to 8 centimeters of wind drift. Making these calculations without electronic aids, in darkness, under stress, while cold and fatigued, and then executing shots that repeatedly struck targets, represents a level of skill that even today would be considered exceptional. The Springfield rifle Williams used was capable of this accuracy, but only in skilled hands. The weapon's bolt-action design required manual cycling between shots, a process that took trained soldiers approximately 2 to 3 seconds under optimal conditions, but could extend to 5 or more seconds under stress or in difficult positions. This meant that after each shot, Williams had to work the bolt, chamber a new round, reacquire his target through the scope, recalculate for any changes in distance or position, and fire again, all while knowing that the German soldiers were attempting to locate him and return fire. The steady repetition of this cycle, maintaining accuracy through multiple shots, demonstrated not just skill, but extraordinary mental discipline. The German perspective on the engagement, assembled from surviving documents and post-war interviews with veterans of the 14th Reconnaissance Company, reveals fascinating details about how the encounter was interpreted. Initial reports characterized the ambush as coming from multiple shooters, an understandable error given the accuracy and rate of fire. Only after careful analysis did German intelligence officers conclude that a single marksman was most likely responsible. A conclusion that generated its own set of questions about American sniper capabilities. Had the Americans begun deploying specialized marksmen in that sector? Was this an isolated incident or evidence of a broader tactical shift? The uncertainty these questions generated affected German operational planning in the region for weeks afterward. For Sergeant Zimmermann, the German team leader who survived the encounter, the experience marked a turning point in his understanding of the conflict. In post-war correspondence with a German military historian researching the 14th Reconnaissance Company's history, Zimmermann wrote that the engagement in December 1944 had shattered certain comfortable illusions he had maintained about enemy capabilities. He had believed, based on training and official assessments, that German soldiers were generally superior to their opponents in skill and motivation. The encounter with Williams's rifle fire demonstrated that individual excellence existed independent of nationality or ideology, that assumptions about enemy inferiority could be fatal, and that warfare ultimately came down to specific people with specific skills rather than abstract national characteristics. The weapons technology of World War II was sufficiently advanced that skilled marksmen could achieve remarkable results, but sufficiently limited that such achievements required exceptional human capability rather than merely competent use of advanced equipment. The telescopic sight on Williams's Springfield provided 4 times magnification, helpful certainly, but nothing like the sophisticated optics available to modern snipers with variable magnification, illuminated reticles, and range-finding capabilities. Williams had to estimate distances based on visual observation, calculate bullet drop and wind drift based on experience rather than ballistic computers, and execute shots without any of the technological aids that current marksmen rely on. His success was fundamentally human, based on skills developed through practice and innate ability rather than technological advantage. The broader narrative of African-American military service during World War II includes numerous examples of exceptional performance that received minimal recognition. The Tuskegee Airmen, who flew combat missions over Europe with distinction, faced both enemy fire and domestic prejudice. Tank battalions, artillery units, and infantry formations repeatedly demonstrated that black soldiers could fight with the same effectiveness as their white counterparts. Yet these demonstrations rarely translated into policy changes or recognition that extended beyond immediate military circles. Williams's story fits this pattern: exceptional achievement, minimal recognition, and a gradual fading from memory that would have been complete without the dedicated research of historians like Morrison. The human cost of prejudice extends beyond the individuals directly affected. When Williams eliminated the German reconnaissance team on December 14th, he potentially saved American lives by preventing intelligence gathering that could have led to effective German operations against American positions. If his skills had been recognized and utilized more systematically, how many additional American lives might have been saved? How many operations might have been more successful? The waste of talent inherent in segregation had tactical and strategic costs that, while impossible to quantify precisely, were undoubtedly significant. The post-war lives of the soldiers involved in the engagement followed diverse paths shaped by the societies they returned to. Williams returned to farming in Mississippi, facing Jim Crow laws that limited his opportunities and denied him basic civil rights despite his military service. Davis, his partner in the observation post, moved to Chicago and worked in manufacturing, becoming active in veterans organizations that advocated for civil rights. The German survivors returned to a destroyed nation that spent decades grappling with its recent history and attempting reconstruction. Vogel, the German soldier whose journal provided documentation of the encounter, became an educator who sometimes used his wartime experiences as teaching moments about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of recognizing individual humanity even in enemies. The military lessons from Williams's engagement have been incorporated into modern sniper training, though often without specific attribution. The importance of patience, the value of allowing targets to move into optimal positions rather than forcing shots, the discipline required to maintain accuracy under stress, and the psychological impact that a skilled marksman can have on enemy forces are all emphasized in contemporary training programs. Williams exemplified these principles through intuition and experience rather than formal training, demonstrating that the fundamentals of effective marksmanship transcend specific training programs or technological generations. The question of how Williams developed his exceptional skills remains partly mysterious. Natural aptitude certainly played a role. Some people possess better hand-eye coordination, steadier hands, and sharper vision than others. But aptitude alone cannot explain his achievement. The thousands of hours he spent hunting as a youth, learning to read wind and estimate distance, understanding how bullets behaved at different ranges, and developing the patience to wait for perfect shots rather than accept merely good ones, created a foundation of practical skill that military training enhanced rather than created. He arrived in the military already possessing capabilities that many dedicated marksmen spend years trying to develop, and his military service provided opportunities to apply those capabilities in contexts where their full value became apparent. The intersection of individual capability and historical circumstance is one of history's recurring themes. Williams possessed extraordinary skills at a moment when those skills could make a meaningful difference, yet the full value of those skills was never realized because institutional prejudice prevented their optimal utilization. How many similar stories exist in history of talented individuals whose potential was constrained by the artificial limitations their societies imposed? The aggregate cost of such waste, across individuals and generations, represents one of civilization's greatest failures. The geographic specificity of the engagement, the cold forests of northeastern France in December 1944, mattered more than might be immediately apparent. The terrain provided the cover and sight lines that made Williams's ambush possible. The weather conditions, while making accurate shooting more difficult, also limited the German team's ability to locate him after the first shot. The tactical situation, with American forces holding defensive positions against German reconnaissance operations, created the context where a single skilled soldier could have disproportionate impact. Different terrain, different weather, or different tactical circumstances might have resulted in a very different outcome. A reminder that historical events emerge from complex combinations of factors rather than single causes. The emotional dimensions of Williams's experience during and after the engagement deserve consideration. Killing enemy soldiers is a profound psychological event regardless of military necessity. Williams never discussed in detail how he felt about taking German lives that December night, maintaining the privacy that many combat veterans prefer regarding their wartime experiences. But accounts from those who knew him suggest that he understood the engagement as a necessary duty performed to protect his fellow soldiers rather than a personal triumph. The moral complexity of combat, the simultaneous presence of duty, skill, fear, and the weight of taking human life was something Williams carried privately, shared only with fellow veterans who had their own experiences of similar complexity. The German soldiers who died that night were themselves individuals with families, dreams, and stories that ended in a French forest. Military history often abstracts away this human reality, focusing on tactics and outcomes rather than the personal tragedies that warfare creates. The German reconnaissance team members were skilled soldiers executing orders, performing their duties as they understood them, unaware that they would encounter someone whose capabilities far exceeded what they had been prepared for. Their deaths were tragic in the way all wartime deaths are tragic, regardless of which side they fought on or what ideologies they may have supported. The documentation that survived the engagement, including Williams's after-action report, Henderson's commendation, German casualty reports, and Vogel's journal, provides unusually complete insight into a minor tactical event that would otherwise have vanished into history's vast archive of forgotten moments. Most combat actions, even those involving casualties and tactical consequences, leave minimal documentary traces. The survival of multiple independent accounts of this particular engagement allows historians to reconstruct it with confidence, to understand not just what happened, but how participants on both sides interpreted and responded to events as they unfolded. The technological limitations of 1944 meant that Williams's shooting was documented only through written reports and human testimony, rather than through photographs or recordings that might have provided additional evidence. Modern combat operations are extensively documented through various technological means, creating detailed records that simplify historical research but also change the nature of warfare itself. Williams operated in a transitional period when warfare retained human scale despite increasing mechanization, when individual skill could still have decisive tactical impact, before technology made warfare so overwhelming that individual contributions became harder to identify and assess. The legacy of Williams's achievement extends beyond military history into broader questions about recognition, memory, and how societies choose to honor exceptional individuals. Thousands of monuments commemorate military achievements across the United States and Europe. Yet none specifically recognize Williams or others like him, whose contributions were minimized or forgotten due to racial prejudice. This selective commemoration reflects historical biases that are only gradually being addressed through more inclusive historical research and recognition efforts. Williams's story, once rescued from obscurity, joins a growing body of work that seeks to provide fuller, more accurate accounts of who contributed what to historical events, independent of whether those individuals received recognition at the time. The military integration that eventually occurred in the American Armed Forces, beginning seriously after World War II and accelerating after President Truman's 1948 executive order mandating equal treatment, was influenced by the accumulated evidence that segregated units like the 92nd Division provided. While no single engagement or individual achievement determined policy outcomes, the collective record of black soldiers performing effectively in combat made arguments for continued segregation increasingly untenable. Williams's December Night contributed one data point to that collective record, a demonstration that could not be explained away or dismissed by those arguing that African Americans were unsuited for combat roles. Modern sniper doctrine emphasizes the importance of patience, precision, and psychological impact rather than volume of fire. A skilled sniper properly positioned can disrupt enemy operations disproportionate to the number of rounds fired, creating uncertainty and fear that affects enemy decision-making beyond the direct casualties inflicted. Williams intuitively understood and exemplified these principles decades before they were formally codified in training manuals. His 5 or 6 carefully aimed shots had impact far exceeding their immediate tactical results, altering German assessments of American capabilities in that sector and demonstrating to his fellow soldiers what determined skill could accomplish. The relationship between Williams and the other soldiers in his unit evolved in the aftermath of the engagement. He had always been respected for his competence, but after December 15th, that respect took on additional dimensions. Soldiers who served with him knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, and that knowledge created a kind of bond that persisted long after the war ended. In later years, when veterans of the 92nd Division held reunions, Williams's name was always mentioned with particular reverence, and stories about the December engagement were told and retold, growing slightly in the telling, but remaining fundamentally accurate in their core details. The broader question of how many other African American soldiers performed exceptional acts that went unrecognized remains unanswerable, but important. Military awards and decorations during World War II were distributed in patterns that reflected racial biases. Black soldiers received proportionally fewer awards than white soldiers despite serving in comparable circumstances. Recent research has identified numerous instances where black soldiers' achievements were documented, but not appropriately recognized, leading to efforts to belatedly award medals and recognition to individuals whose contributions were minimized or ignored. Williams received his Bronze Star, which was significant, but did his achievement warrant higher recognition that prejudice prevented? The available evidence suggests it did. The intersection of military service and civil rights created complex dynamics for African American soldiers during and after World War II. They fought for a nation that denied them basic rights, participated in defeating regimes that promoted racial supremacy, while living under domestic systems that enforced racial subordination, and returned from military service to face continued discrimination. Williams never publicly discussed these contradictions, maintaining the dignity and privacy that characterized his approach to life. But the contradictions existed regardless of whether he discussed them, and they shaped the experiences of hundreds of thousands of black veterans who struggled to understand how they could be considered heroes abroad while being treated as second-class citizens at home. The technical specifications of the M1903 Springfield rifle Williams used provide context for understanding his achievement. The weapon fired .30-06 ammunition at muzzle velocities around 860 meters per second, producing approximately 3,600 joules of energy at the muzzle. At 350 meters, typical engagement range for Williams's shots, the bullet would still possess approximately 2,200 joules of energy, more than sufficient for its purpose. The trajectory required the bullet to rise above the line of sight for the first 200 meters, before dropping progressively thereafter, creating an arc that marksmen had to understand and compensate for. The weapon's accuracy potential was approximately 2.5 centimeters, at 100 meters under ideal conditions with quality ammunition, scaling to approximately 9 centimeters at 350 meters, meaning Williams had to place his shots within a relatively small area to achieve the results he did. The historical record of the 92nd Infantry Division includes both the engagement discussed here and numerous other actions that collectively demonstrate the capabilities of African American soldiers in combat. Some operations succeeded brilliantly, others encountered difficulties, and overall performance matched what would be expected from any infantry division operating under similar conditions. The fact that the division's performance was held to different standards than white units, that its failures were emphasized while successes were minimized, reflects the prejudices of the era rather than actual military performance. Modern historical analysis, less influenced by racial assumptions, provides more balanced assessments that recognize both the accomplishments and challenges the division faced. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.